So to finish up this Thursday show on Bang the Book Radio, I'll roll through a lot of the college football games that we didn't get to here on our previous segments throughout the course of the week. And again, with college football, and we had a little bit of an extended NBA discussion with Brian Leonard on Wednesday's show. No show on Monday, of course. There are some games that we definitely missed here over the course of the week, so I'll roll through as many of those as I possibly can here to finish up this Thursday show. Virginia Tech and Georgia Tech is a really interesting game on Saturday. And again, obviously these two teams aren't going to get a whole lot of run overall. Virginia Tech, early on in the season, they didn't look very good. They didn't look very good at all. Now, all of the sudden, Virginia Tech is in a really interesting position because they play Georgia Tech this week. Then they play Pitt, and then they play Virginia. Virginia plays Liberty, and then Virginia Tech. If Virginia Tech wins out, they will win the ACC Coastal, which is absolutely crazy to think about, given that early on in the season, they lost to Boston College in week 1, struggled with Old Dominion, struggled with Furman, got rolled by Duke. At that point, I threw them away. I dismissed that team. We even talked on this show about Justin Fuente and his job security there in Blacksburg. Now Virginia Tech in a position to do some really special things here within the conference, which is absolutely crazy. Crazier still, they're only a 5.5-point road favorite this week against Georgia Tech. And Georgia Tech has been a plucky underdog. They've been a very competitive team in a lot of their underdog situations, most of them much bigger than this. They've covered and even won outright on games as a double-digit, 3-score type of underdog. They're not in that role here this week, but man, is this an interesting game. Virginia Tech, 4.5-point favorite on the road, taking on Georgia Tech. My number in this game is right on 5.5. So at least I've got these two teams power rated accurately because, again, Georgia Tech has been so good in that really big dog role, and I had to make a lot of adjustments with Virginia Tech. So I'm happy to see my number right here on the market number at 5.5, but a lot of people are going to say that it probably looks light. Public percentages show overwhelming support for Virginia Tech here in this game, and the line hasn't moved. So the books are still waiting to see if they get some measure of sharp action on the Georgia Tech side. If they go to 6, maybe they think it's going to happen. Maybe they feel like they don't need to go to 6 as of yet. So that's a fascinating game to watch on Saturday. Again, sometimes these games with really intriguing line moves can be throwaway types of games, or even the games without any sort of line move can be throwaway games because they're overshadowed by different matchups in the market. But this is very much one to have on your radar, where Virginia Tech playing really well, the only loss in that span at Notre Dame, a game they very well could have won, and they're only laying 5.5 against the Georgia Tech team that has 2 wins on the season, 1 in conference play, a win over Miami. I believe that was in overtime. Interesting, to say the least here, to not see this line move despite the public support for the Hokies. Again, either implies that we've got some Georgia Tech sharp money out there, or that there's the worry that it will come in and hasn't come in yet. So that's definitely a game to watch there in that 3:30 window on Saturday. Tulane and Temple, we have seen line movement on this one. Tulane up from 3.5 to 6, market wide out there. I only have this one 1.5, so I've got a big overlay here. But this late in the season, when you've got a lot of data points about these teams, like we do with Tulane and Temple, and you've got a line that opened 2 points higher than your number and then moved 2.5 points in the other direction, odds are you're missing something. And the market has been very high on Tulane here, really over the course of the season. Tulane is a team that has exceeded expectation from an ATS standpoint, even though they are just 6-3 and 3-2 in conference play. The market does like Tulane. And maybe this has to do with Tulsa and the win that they had last week, knocking off Central Florida. Maybe people looking at that Tulsa game and saying, well, they're actually pretty good. Maybe we give Tulane a pass for that one, only winning that game by 12 in a game that really was pretty close throughout. I mean, it was a 24-16 game at halftime. The yardage totals weren't that far off. But Tulane has been a sharp team over the course of the season here. And I mentioned in that previous segment with Brad that typically when I get a sharp side, I end up overcompensating for it, like a Louisville. I haven't done that with Tulane here. Maybe I should. Maybe I do need to make some Tulane adjustments here for their remaining games. Maybe I need to drop Temple down as well. So even though I've got a 4.5-point overlay here with some of the key numbers of 3 and 4 in play, I'm still not taking Temple. Because again, if at this point in the year, it's not an injury-related situation, a line moves against you that much, something is wrong with your number. And it's important to recognize that. It's important to realize that. It's a realization that I've come to here in this game. So even though I've got a power ratings overlay, I have no interest in Temple. We'll see how that game winds up playing out. Maybe Temple does play well in that one. But also, I don't love Rod Carey. And, Rod Carey deeper in the year here in his first year at Temple, just not a team I'm really looking to back. So no thoughts from me on that game, except to, again, mention that, if something moves against you this late in the year when it already opened off of your number, probably a good time to readjust and reevaluate the number that you've got on that game. Staying in the AAC, Cincinnati and South Florida, 327, 328. Cincinnati up from 13 to 14 here, taking on a South Florida team that I really haven't had much of an opinion of for most of the season here. And yet, my line on this game, just 11.5. So again, another line move, moving slightly against me, but I can't take USF here. And again, Cincinnati, one of those teams that the market has been on. It's been interesting with Cincinnati here, too, because they've had several situations later on in the season where the totals on their games have come down, but their big favorite role has gone up. So it does seem like the sharp crowd, the quant crowd, whatever you want to call them here, likes this Cincinnati defense quite a bit. This is one of those scenarios where the total has come down from 50 to 46.5, and the side has gone up, albeit only to 14 from the opener of 13. So this is one of those similar spots that we've seen with Cincinnati a lot here in the second half of the year. I have no reason to believe that the market is wrong in this game. The under makes sense. Cincinnati makes sense. USF's defense is okay. USF's offense is awful. So, again, I would not go against my power rating here with the 11.5 number. I think Cincinnati probably the side, but at 14, tough to say that there's a whole lot of value in that line. Syracuse and Duke, 329, 330. Duke, a 10.5-point favorite here in this game. My line 11, so I'm right there in line with the market. But if I had to do anything with this game, I'd lay the number with Duke. Duke has underachieved this season. Quentin Harris played very well at the outset. He has regressed. He has not taken good care of the football. He has not progressed as a thrower, which is something we're used to seeing from David Cutcliffe types of quarterbacks. The running game hasn't been great for Duke. That's certainly hurt them. They've kind of one-dimensionalized themselves on offense. I'm just making up words here. But the running game, just 3.8 yards per carry. But in this particular spot here, against a Syracuse team that is very, very bad, against a Syracuse team that is probably not going to go to a bowl game with road games at Duke, at Louisville, against Wake Forest. They fired defensive coordinator Brian Ward, a guy who's been with Dino Babers for a little while. This is a chance for Duke to let out some frustration against somebody, I think. They were a misleading cover against Georgia Tech, winning by 18. Georgia Tech went for 2, should have covered the number, weren't able to do so. Although if you got 18.5 on Georgia Tech, they did actually cover that one. The following week, blowout loss to Virginia, heartbreaking loss to North Carolina, maybe some carryover there in that game against Notre Dame. I think this is a get-right spot for Duke. Duke wants to go to a bowl game. They've got to win 2 of their last 3 games to do it here. I don't think Syracuse is that mobilized for that. Their offensive line is beyond awful. I think Duke is the only way you look in that game. I think this is a chance for Duke to possibly let out some frustration. So, again, not a power ratings play for me. My line's only 11. But Duke, with what they've gone through here so far this season, I think it is an opportunity for them to kind of right the ship a little bit. Ohio State and Rutgers. I don't know what you can really say about this game. Ohio State, a 52.5-point favorite. There is a 53.5 out there as well against Rutgers. Total of 61.5. The money's been on the over here in this one. So obviously the expectation that Rutgers is not going to provide any resistance defensively. And Ohio State's going to go very young in the second half. And, their reserve defense last week in the game against Maryland did have some issues. I mean, they gave up some yards. They had some undisciplined penalties. They gave up some points there in that second half. Maybe the expectation that happens again here this week. Ohio State could hang 100 if they want to here. I don't think that they do. But what's been interesting here in the lead up to this game this week is that there's been a lot of talk about Chris Chugunov, the backup quarterback for Ohio State, how he's fitting into the system, how he likes the system, how Ohio State getting increasingly more confident in their backup quarterback situation in the event that something happens to Justin Fields. Now, maybe they're just blowing smoke, but maybe there's some legitimacy to this here too. So maybe Ohio State just keeps going with Chugunov. DeMario McCall found the end zone last week. Master Teague has been great, as we know. The over probably makes some sense here in this game. I'm not laying 52.5 with the Buckeyes. My line is, I believe, 51 here for this game. I'm not laying the big number. I think it's kind of borderline crazy to do that. But I do think that the over does make some sense here because you've got an Ohio State second-team offense that's been very good, and Ohio State second-team defense that is maybe a little bit undisciplined, is maybe a little bit unpolished. I think you've got a chance here for some points in this game between Ohio State and Rutgers. And also, too, I mean, Ohio State hung 73 last week on Maryland. They could very well go over this total themselves in this game this week. Troy and Texas State, game 345, 346 is kind of interesting to me here. Troy, they've been up and down this season. You wondered how things would be first year without Neil Brown. They've had some good performances. They've had some bad performances. Last week was a good performance, 49-28 over Georgia Southern, come from losing the two games previously to Georgia State and Coastal Carolina. Coastal going for two and getting it late in that game. So Troy very well could have beaten Coastal on the road. Maybe a get-right game there for them in that game against Georgia Southern. Texas State, look, Texas State's been a sharp team. I think people want Texas State to be good. They've got an exciting coaching staff there with Jake Spavital and Bob Stitt. They've got some offensive players that aren't bad. Recruiting was a little bit better here this previous cycle. And they've been a team that's been 129 or 130 in everybody's power ratings over the last several years. People want them to be good. They do get the win last week, but a late fourth quarter field goal where they were trailing a pretty bad South Alabama team. Now, South Alabama has a knack for hanging around in these games where they are the inferior team. They tend to cover in a lot of lower scoring types of games. For whatever reason, they're kind of, tough defensively. They bend but don't break a whole lot. So maybe it shouldn't be a surprise that they hung in there with Texas State. But again this week, Texas State taking money, down from 8.5 to 7. My line on this game is 5. So I agree with the line move. However, again, I think that it's one of those things where maybe I over-adjusted Texas State because the market was trying so hard to like them. And again, I mean, early on in the year, they played Wyoming tough. Wyoming winds up being a very good team this year. They beat Georgia State, which is one of the crazier results of the season here so far. I just don't see it for Texas State. I don't see the reason to love this team. And maybe Troy did find something. Billingsley with a good game on the ground. Barker throws for 3 bills and 3 scores. Maybe Troy kind of found something last week with a first-year head coach in Chip Lindsey. I would have to go against my power rating here. I'm not going to do it, but if I had to do anything for a spread pool or something like that, I think Troy, now that they're down to 7, would be the side in this one. Again, there's just so much hopefulness about Texas State that hasn't come to fruition here so far that I just don't see a reason to believe in it this week, even though my line does suggest that maybe Texas State had a little bit of value at 8.5 and 7.5. Again, maybe I over-adjusted because of the sharp steam coming in on the Bobcats. Game 349, 350 here. UCLA and Utah. Utah 21-point favorite in this one. We've seen this theme a lot here. Total comes down. Utah grows as a favorite. Total down from 54 to 52 here. Look, Utah has done no wrong. I mentioned this last week that Utah has done no wrong since that game that they lost against USC. And that was a coin flip type of game too. Since then, they beat Washington, shut out Cal, dominated Arizona State, dominated Oregon State, dominated Washington State. They beat up on teams. They've gotten into that bully role. They're off a bye here, taking on a UCLA team that had garnered a little bit of sharp interest. But now, again, you see Utah money coming in, and this line could swing on game day. We could see it back down into the 20 range. But it's very tough to fade Utah right now. My number 18.5, so Not a whole lot of power ratings value one way or another. But Utah has, again, done no wrong. There's no reason at this point in time to step in front of that Utah train. And to do so with Chip Kelly and UCLA, I think is a tall ask as well. So I like Utah a little bit here, but again, laying a big number, total of 54, always scary. I always want to look first at the points in those games. When you don't see a reason to take the points, it's pretty tough to take the favorite in that scenario. Wyoming and Utah State, game 353, 354 here. I've got this one lined Utah State minus 4.5. Lines come down from 6 to 5.5 or 5, so moving in the direction of my number. Craig Bohl might just be a magic man. It's not sexy football. It's not fun to watch. It's a smash mouth throwback type of style, but damn if it doesn't work for the Wyoming Cowboys. You know, they lose Sean Chambers and you think, okay, they lose their second leading rusher. They're going to have to change some things. They're going to have to do some things differently. And they are right there in that game with Boise State last week. And there was a lot of support for Boise State. That line got very high in that game. And Boise State has to go to overtime, win it 20-17. Now, I will acknowledge this is not a great spot for Wyoming. Coming off of putting so much into that Boise State game, coming up just short. Now they don't have a chance in the Mountain West Mountain Division. But how can you doubt Craig Bohl and what he's done with this Cowboys program? It is interesting to see Utah State open this big of a favorite, given that there's been a strong anti-Aggies sentiment here this season because they're just not the same team that they were last year. Walk-off field goal for them last week against Fresno State. Tough spot for them, too. I don't know if they're ready for this type of game. I don't know if Jordan Love can have success against this Wyoming defense. And we know Utah State struggles to run the football. So it's Wyoming for me here. It would have to be at the 5.5 number. Again, pretty close to my numbers, but it would just have to be Wyoming if that's the kind of way that you're looking in that game. Georgia State and Appalachian State. Appalachian State coming off of the win against South Carolina. Wasn't particularly impressed with either team in that game. It's always impressive to, see what happens here with Appalachian State coming off of these games against Power 5 competition. But this is a difficult one because you've got Georgia State going into this one without Dan Ellington, out with a knee injury. This line adjusted about 1.5, 2 points here. Maybe it was known that Ellington was going to be out before the market opened, but when you talk about guys and their value to the line, Dan Ellington has been so incredible at Georgia State here so far this season. I think this adjustment looks light. Appalachian State laying a big number, laying almost 3 scores in this one. My line on this game was 7, so maybe the adjustment has been factored into the equation for Ellington being out. About a 10-point adjustment, it would appear. That makes sense. So I guess I'll take back what I said there. My apologies for not looking at this one in the proper context. It does seem like everyone knew that Ellington was going to be out. So this adjustment makes sense. And it's a shame that Ellington is out for this game because it would have been very intriguing otherwise. But again, probably about a 10-point adjustment for Ellington here in the market. That's probably accurate. We'll see if Ellington is able to go next week. If he's not, obviously, about a 10-point adjustment coming for me on Georgia State in my power ratings. Game 361, 362, USC and Cal. This line up from 5.5 to 6.5 or so here. My line in this game, Cal +4, though I've been much higher in the market on Cal than a lot of people here. I had Cal much lower last week against Washington State. Didn't play it because I thought, what do I have wrong here? And, of course, I had nothing wrong because they wound up really blowing out Washington State there in that game. I'm wondering about USC. I'm wondering about this Trojans program and what their current mindset is. Because they had Arizona State last week without Jaden Daniels. It could have been a runaway train. And it was early on. And then they let ASU back into the game. Gave up almost 300 yards through the air to the backup quarterback, Joey Yellen. Where is USC at this point in time? They're either bowl eligible now. They've got the LA battle in a couple weeks' time here against UCLA. But I just don't know where they are. They know Clay Helton's not going to be around. They know Graham Harrell's probably not going to be retained, depending on who the new head coach is. But what is USC's mindset right now? Cal, terrible offensively, as we know. Very, very good defensively. Can they hang around in this game? Can they cover those NFL caliber wide receivers for USC? That's the question here. Do I take Cal here after missing out on them last week? If it gets to 7, I'm going to. At 6.5, I'm not sure yet. But if it gets to 7, I'll take a piece of Cal here against USC in that Pac-12 after dark late game coming up on Saturday night. South Carolina, Texas A&M. Texas A&M, an 11-point favorite here. I'm very worried about South Carolina going forward. They are not making a bowl game. They would have to beat A&M and beat Clemson. I don't think it happens. They've had a lot of injuries here throughout the year. Brian Edwards is way less than 100%. We saw that in the final drive against Appalachian State last week. And Ryan Helinski, he's made some throws. He's missed a lot of throws too. He's had a lot of freshman moments here so far this season. 60.4% ratio, 11-4 touchdown interception ratio, but teams have dropped some picks. He's thrown some very dangerous footballs here. We've seen some good. We've seen some bad. What happens against Texas A&M? What I like here in this game is I like the under. South Carolina's offense is just, they're not explosive. They've had a couple of big plays here and there, but Helinski's inconsistency has been a big problem. Shi Smith has been hurt. Brian Edwards has been hurt. South Carolina runs the football well when Feaster's out there. When he's not, they really struggle to run the ball. I think they've got some problems here against Texas A&M's defense. On the other hand, I don't love Texas A&M's offense either. I think South Carolina's defense is pretty decent. I think you've got an A&M team that is very hit or miss on the offensive side. To me, I think this profiles as a lower scoring game. I don't think we see a lot of explosive plays here. I like the under 51 in this South Carolina and Texas A&M game. TCU and Texas Tech, a game I originally wanted to talk about with Brad, but in the interest of talking about some other games, I left that one off the board. TCU, a 3-point favorite here. Total on this game of 56.5. I've been way too low on TCU just about all season long. I've finally got it to a place where I've caught up with the market. Texas Tech opened a 1-point favorite. Now TCU a 3-point favorite. My line, TCU -2 in this one. So I'm finally more in line with where the market is. So I'm happy with that. This is a stay away game for me. Early kickoff in Lubbock. Bad spot for TCU. There were some concerns about Max Duggan and his health going into that game against Baylor. He gets through it. Soldiers on. But you got, Jet Duffy and Alan Bowman both healthy now for Texas Tech. You could have a timeshare at quarterback. Those always worry me. Game I'm staying far, far away from. But at least I'm finally in line with the market a little bit on that one. How about Florida and Missouri? Game we didn't get to with Brad. Florida 6.5-point favorite. Total on this game with Kelly Bryant back in the fold for Missouri is 50.5. So it went up to 51 from 48.5. Came back down now a little bit. Interesting game. Missouri has been very underwhelming, very disappointing here on the season. Florida, I've been high on at times. I've been low on at times. My line here is 6.5. So I'm right in line with the market with Kelly Bryant back for this one. I don't know what to think about Florida offensively. I think Dan Mullen's a very good play caller. I think they have some weapons. I think Kyle Trask has looked good at times. But they're not the type of team I want to try and get margin with. Even though they did it last week against Vanderbilt, Missouri's a much better team. For Missouri here, this is kind of a backs against the wall type of game because they have underexceeded expectations. And are they going to get to a bowl game? They should. Florida at home, Tennessee at home, on the road at Arkansas on a short week. They only need one more win to get there. But they've dropped 3 straight. To Vanderbilt, Kentucky, and Georgia. They've scored 21 points in the process. This is a game where I think they have to circle the wagons. And I think that they can. I like Missouri plus the 6.5. I like the under in this game as well. I think Missouri is a better team than people realize now because they've had these 3 straight losing efforts. There's probably some value on the Tigers at this point in time. There was no value coming into the season. A lot of people were too high on Missouri. I kind of tried to stay, below that fray a little bit, kind of lay low, look to fade Missouri. Early on, they played very well. In the middle of the portion of the year here, they've come back to where I sort of thought they would be. I think now may be a buy point on the Tigers in a low-scoring game, getting the 6.5. So I do like Missouri a little bit here in this weekend's action. We talk about LSU and Ole Miss here to finish up the show. This is such a fascinating spot. LSU, of course, off that huge win against Alabama. The Quant crowd loves them. There's no reason not to love them with that offense. But this is a bad spot against Ole Miss here in a lot of different ways. They're laying 21.5, line up from 20.5. I don't like Ole Miss. I'm not a huge fan of Ole Miss. My line in this game is 25. But can you really lay a huge number with LSU here when Ole Miss, by and large, has played pretty well this season overall? They played close against Auburn, at least as far as the final score would indicate. The yardage was much more misleading than that. Texas A&M, they were close in that game. Missouri, they hung around in that one. They beat Vanderbilt like they should, had over 400 yards against Alabama. Ole Miss hasn't been bad. Could LSU blow them out? Yeah, they very much could. This could be a game for Joe Burrow to go pad his numbers. On the other hand, I mean, you're number one in the college football playoff rankings now. You beat Alabama for the first time in a while. You beat Auburn the week before, 2 weeks before that. You got your win over Florida. Is this a spot where LSU is completely focused? I don't know. We find out a lot about Ed Orgeron here. We found out a lot about Ed Orgeron already in marquee games and how good he's done in those. We find out a lot about Ed Orgeron here in terms of avoiding the flat spot for his team, because this is very much one. I don't know if I'll play it. Maybe at 21.5, it's worth a look. Going against my power ratings here. But again, I just don't see how LSU, fully mobilized to go out there and blow out this team after such an emotional win last week. And now you're back on the road in Oxford. It's a tough spot for LSU here, to say the least. So at 21.5, I may take a piece of Ole Miss. It would be a smaller play for me, but I may end up taking a piece here of the Rebels.